Thank you, Louisa. And thank you all for the opportunity to be here with you, recognizing that I'm the last thing between you and maybe flights, and for the team, certainly a well-earned drink. I will attempt to be brief and stick to my time here. I thought Daniel and Divya set up my presentation exceptionally well, and you'll see why in a second, because what I'd like to do is I was going to talk about technology, but clearly not my friend. There you go, perfect. Yeah, the on button. Excellent. So what I'd like to do is cover four things with you. The context for why skills are becoming the currency for work. You saw a little bit of that a few minutes ago. What that skills-powered organization looks like, which in many respects is calling for the reversal of about 140 years of skill set, mindset, and tool set of how we think about work. What that design journey looks like, and what the prizes and what the analytics that underpin that skills-powered organization look like. And I'll draw on a couple of things. I'll draw on some of the research that we did for the skills-powered organization book that was published by the MIT Press at the end of last year, but also a couple of my earlier books, as well as some research from the World Economic Forum that we published earlier this year. So why the context for skills? A few months ago, the IMF estimated that the volatility of the global economy, their uncertainty index, was at 3 times the historical 30-year average. Not 3%, but 3 times. And that was before this latest round of insanity, right, for the last few weeks. And with that, what we're seeing, if you think of the impact of AI that Daniel talked about and the advances there, the geopolitical crises that we have, if you think of the climate crisis, all of those things are injecting a level of uncertainty into the economy. And for the economists among you, you obviously will appreciate that what that calls for is a fundamentally different mindset and a fundamentally different set of building blocks for work if we're going to have that agile enterprise that is able to adjust to uncertainty. Speaking of uncertainty, if you think of what that means for organizations, so the world has always been complicated. It's nowhere near as complex as it is today. And certainly it'll be a lot more complex tomorrow. When you've got a complicated environment, what that calls for is what we've built our organizations on for the last 140 years. This premium on scale, efficiency, and an expertise focus. Those traditional hierarchical structures stood us in good stead because the world was a lot more predictable. When you've got uncertainty, that calculus changes dramatically. Increasingly, that emphasis is on speed, agility, and an execution focus, continuously testing and learning, continuously iterating, because tomorrow is always going to be unpredictable. And so you don't want to build up significant amounts of fixed cost in the operating model. What you start to see is leadership changing from those traditional command and control structures to increasingly this notion of leadership from the edges. Leadership from the edges because that's where innovation, that's where diversity of thought and ideas have their most significant payoff. And what that means for the traditional structure of organizations is the shift from left to right, as you see here, from those traditional hierarchical structures built for certainty at very high fixed cost to more hybrid and agile structures where cost gets to be dissipated across networks, and increasingly agile and networked ecosystems, which, as we'll talk about, are powered by skills as the currency for work versus merely being built on this notion of jobs and hierarchy. It's also where you start to see structure giving way to culture as the thing that unites and connects disparate interests to a common mission and purpose. I mentioned the work that I do at the World Economic Forum. I sit on their steering committee on work and employment and have done so for the last 10 years. Who here has seen their Future of Jobs report? Okay, a couple of hands. Those of you who haven't, take a look at it. It is one of the most thoughtful pieces of work. It's, I think, close to 600 pages. You don't have to go through all of it. But it's got really interesting industry and geography cuts, which is what makes for the length. But the thing that was interesting about it to me this time around were two things. One was the rapid rise in prominence of the non-technical skills, and you see that showing up. The second, and this was a feature of the conversations that were held in Davos this year, is the pivot from after 2 years of talking about how cool generative AI was and all these interesting use cases for ChatGPT, and Daniel talked about this as well, to this recognition that after 2 years, the reason we haven't gotten to some of these productivity gains is because we have consistently taken a tech forwards view of the world versus a work backwards view. And the basic building block and the basic calculus is often wrong. And that's what we saw for the first time, is that interest in and that shift in focus among many CEOs to emphasize upskilling and reskilling of the workforce, because the old calculus for transformation, which said that, my business model has changed, I'm going to fire a bunch of people over here with these legacy skills and go out and hire all of those people over there with the cool skills and pay above market premiums because all of my competitors are chasing the same skills, doesn't work anymore. And I'll share with you some analytics that my co-author and I developed for her board. She's the Chief Strategy Officer at Standard Chartered Bank as part of their transition. But I'll come to that later in a few minutes. So when I look at this changing calculus, I think all of us as soon-to-be business leaders, current business leaders, are going to have to answer two questions consistently. How do we bend the demand curve of work in a fundamentally different way? And how do we bend the supply curve of work? And what I mean by bending the demand curve of work is, how do we redesign work to enable talent to flow to work as seamlessly as possible, while giving them the space and the assets to keep reinventing themselves, recognizing that that next generation business model is one where we progressively decouple future growth from resource intensity. Those hierarchical models I started off talking about, think of Ford, and the simplest example and contrast is probably Ford and Uber. With Ford, when I hit my maximum capacity for a plant, what's the marginal cost of setting up a new plant? Exponentially high, right? New plants, upgraded distribution networks, new retail sites, etc., all with this notion of building the next vehicle that all of us will own. What's the cost for Uber to acquire another customer or another driver? Close to zero, right? And it's that notion where not only is that asset become a service, but it's also fundamentally changed the calculus and the economics of work, if that example makes sense. So think of that as bending the demand curve of work in a different way. Equally, bending the supply curve of work so that work is much more accessible to a lot more people. And it's where skills become really important. The organization that I get a kick out of, I've worked with them for many years. They were a case study in my second book, IBM. Today, more than 55% of IBM's jobs have no degree requirement, which for those of us with a little bit of gray hair will remember, this is Big Blue we're talking about. No degree? My gosh, this was the guys with dark suits and white shirts, right? But to have no degrees is actually a pretty remarkable shift, thanks to Ginny and Diane Gearson, who sort of led that charge. So again, think of it as bending the demand curve and supply curve of work in fundamentally different ways. So if that's why we need the skills-powered organization, let's talk about what it looks like. This visual you've probably got different representations of it when you think of workforce planning, when you think of your strategic plans, etc. What you're starting to see is the calculus for work shift from that one-to-one relationship, a degree matched to a person, matched to a position, to the increasingly many-to-many between skills and work, and the numerous ways in which those skills can be connected to work. And this calculus illustrates, if we start from the demand side of the equation and connect it all the way to how we think about work and human capability and resourcing it, answering four fundamentally different questions, four questions in fundamentally different ways. What are the skills we need to actually get work done, as opposed to what's the job we need, what's the person, what's the position that is going to get this work done, but what's that bundle of skills that are required to get the work done? What skills do we have in the organization today? One of the most fascinating statistics was when we were writing the book, Bill Winters, the CEO of Standard Chartered Bank, 170-year-old bank, asked my co-author, what sort of data science capability do we have? And she said, well, let me go figure it out. And he goes, no, just tell me how many people in the job. Wrong answer, right? Because they had 300 data science job. They had close to 13,000 people who had data science skills. And so if you looked for people for the job as being the marker for that skill and capability, you would have greatly understated what the organization could actually do. So what skills do we have now? What are the gaps we need to close? And equally, how do we not just close skill gaps, but develop and deploy those skills at scale and speed as the demand changes, as this volatile world we're in continues to pivot and grow? So 4 questions that kind of underpin the design of the skills-powered organization. Now, what is underlying that, or the response to those questions, is a very different work operating system. My 4th book was called Work Without Jobs, and it was published in 2022. And in it, my co-author John and I talked about a work operating system that is based on the elemental tasks and activities that underpin work, and the skills and capabilities, human or machine, that are required for executing that. And there were 4 principles that consistently came to the fore in the research that we did. The first being, forget the jobs, forget how they're organized and structured. What are those elemental tasks and activities? Secondly, instead of, as I said earlier, starting tech forwards, how do we go about doing this work backwards? So how do we redesign work around these emerging technology capabilities? Because what we see when we start with the tasks and activities, we see 3 very different relationships. We see where certain types of work are substituted by process automation, machine learning, deep learning, Gen AI, or agentic AI. We see where other types of work are augmented by some of these technology capabilities. And the thing that we often miss is, where does the presence of these technologies actually create the demand for new types of work and new types of skills? The third principle is, once we've gotten to those optimal combinations, what's the best way to connect people to work? Should it be someone in a job, someone in an agile talent pool, or perhaps that gig worker? What's the best way for people to engage with the work? And the 4th is, how do we ensure that as the world changes, as organizations change, that we don't have a mindset, skill set, or tool set that is tied to one and done. Those old days of where I could transform the business and leave it alone for the next 7 to 9 years are gone, right? How do we build a mindset where managers and leaders have the capability to keep reinventing work continuously and doing that in the flow of work, rather than expecting someone to come in and transform the business? So 4 principles that kind of underpin this operating system built on skills and tasks. And when we took that model and sort of looked at how work was changing, Daniel talked about some of the research on the impact of Gen AI. So I'm not going to touch the left side of it because he's covered it well. It's the right side of this graph that is really interesting, because we took that framework, overlaid it against work that Wharton has done, work that Brynjolfsson at Stanford has done, and we looked at how the composition of work was changing. So on the left, back at the end of 2022, this was the average mix of work in the US economy, the mix of transactional versus relational versus expertise-driven activity. How that's expected to change in the next 5 years, and I think most importantly, the impact of not just Gen AI, and I think this is where it gets interesting, but the multiplier effect of process automation combined with machine learning and Gen AI and agentic AI, and how it differentially affects the work, and by design, the underlying skills associated with the work. It's not tough to envision that 7 to 8 years from now, we may not see contact centers anymore. as more and more work shifts on to agentic AI. And increasingly, those tools being used to augment the relational work, the work we do collaborating together, the expertise-driven work. One of the most fascinating things is looking at these shifting skill premiums, is looking at the reduction of the experience premium in many different professions. We've seen that in contact centers, where there was a study done out of Stanford which showed that the average gain in productivity in a contact center from the use of a large language model was about 14%, but the gain for the least experienced was 35%. Because that experience premium that we've traditionally relied on, where proficiency levels and skills go up, was increasingly being reduced because these tools and technologies, by virtue of democratizing information and to a lesser extent creativity, have raised the bar and exponentially improved the productivity of some of the least experienced folks, the least proficient talent. So if that's an example of that second principle in action, the optimal combinations of humans and machines, the third of how do we best connect talent to work and why is it important to have skills? We, as we were writing the book, talked about 3 models for connecting talent to work. The one on the far left is where we've been forever, right? That one-to-one relationship between a person and a position. And that notion of a job still makes a lot of sense, particularly when the control variable is one of, rather the objective variable is one of control and compliance. So think of your airline pilots or drillers on oil rigs. I really would like them to be doing those jobs full time and not doing Uber on the weekends. You know, there is such a premium to their proficiency, right, as we know. But again, it's where the objective function is one of compliance and control. Increasingly, though, what we're seeing, and who here knows what a talent marketplace is? Excellent. Better than average, actually, for me, in terms of the hands that went up. So a talent marketplace is where organizations use a technology platform to connect workforces, whether it's their employees, gig workers, to opportunities and projects and assignments. One example is Unilever. Today, all 70,000 of their white-collar talent are on their talent marketplace and have the ability to create projects or take on projects and assignments. And that's that flexible model. You might be in a job, but you've got the flexibility to express your skills in different domains or the flexibility to acquire skills. The big gain from that is optimal capacity management. Every organization that has introduced a marketplace and done it well sees an almost immediate lift in the utilization of the skills they have because they uncover skills that they didn't know existed and they're able to connect them to work more seamlessly. So if that's, think of it as fixed, flex, and flow with the 3 models. So if that's the flexible model where you go in this hybrid state of the job and skills being the currency for work, the flow model is what I think of as being kind of agile on steroids, basically. And that's where everyone might be in a job, but they're connecting to work based on their skills through projects and assignments and gigs. In the book, we had a very large European insurer that moved all their data scientists from traditional fixed jobs stuck in IT to that flow model where everyone was in an agile talent pool, taking on projects across the organization as their business model shifted from a traditional agent-based model to a direct-to-consumer model. The gain in productivity that they saw in 18 months from unleashing the talent was 600%. And the reason for that is what you now have is that talent being able to take on work across the enterprise. And those flow models are particularly relevant when you need scarce skills across the operating model. So having them bound up in a traditional function really limits their agility and limits their access to work. And the thing that's going to get interesting for all of us is that all 3 models need to exist in your average business model today. Certainly the direction of travel is from left to right, but in your average large organization, we're seeing all 3 models exist. Different value propositions, different rules for managers and leaders in terms of how to orchestrate and connect talent to work when you think of all 3. So if that's what the skills-powered organization looks like, what does that design journey then start to look like? And when we were writing the book and through our research, there were three things that consistently jumped out at us. If you think of the organization as essentially being made up of three big blocks, right? Your business, your workforce, and the culture that shapes the way the organization operates. The first was what we notionally termed work design. And you saw that in those 4 questions earlier. Do we understand the changing demand signals for work? Do we understand the supply of human skills and machine capability? And can we design work so that we're making the optimal connections between those two? Understanding where machine capability may have a comparative advantage over human capability, where might it augment that human capability? And how do we best connect talent to work through the fixed, flex, or flow model? So this notion of work design becoming a really important capability. The second was connecting that understanding of supply and demand to developmental at scale and speed. As opposed to traditional learning and development, how do we ensure that talent is experiencing learning in both personalized and a contextualized sense? To give you an example, I've got a very large manufacturing client where in the past it used to be everyone went through the traditional training as people came in, as they replaced talent, as they stood up a new factory. Today they've got, it's like Baskin and Robbins. It's 90 different flavors of training for the same machine, because it's completely a function of my experience, my expertise, and my skills versus Louisa's. And that way, it's not a 2-week class that everyone goes through. I could be done in 2 hours, and she might need the full 2 weeks, or vice versa, because it's highly personalized and contextualized with the use of VR and AR, so that they're not just doing traditional learning, but we're collapsing the learn-do cycle, so that as someone is working on a piece of equipment, she's getting a supervisor beamed in at times where she needs help. She's getting an overlay of specific bits of data as she's operating a particular piece of precision equipment. So it's development at real scale and speed. And then equally, we're not just going to do development for the sake of development, but as the world changes, how do we ensure we're deploying those skills back to work as quickly and as productively as possible? And it's where these tech marketplaces become incredibly important as a way of deploying skills much more quickly. So 3 core capabilities for that skills-powered organization. And so when you think about getting started, there are a number of things that we kind of ended the book with these 3 things. The first was, let's ensure we have a North Star. I mentioned that I was going to come back to the work that we did at Standard Chartered Bank. What triggered a multi-year journey with them to make skills the currency of work was a piece of analysis that we showed their board. As they become the bank that is going to basically serve the growing affluent communities in East Asia, the Middle East, and Africa because of their traditional and legacy presence, their business model is changing really quickly. So the demand for relationship managers in the high net worth segments is growing up exponentially. They also, on the corporate bank, are rapidly becoming one of the main banks that are financing the transition to net zero. So 2 rapidly growing areas, while their traditional retail bank is increasingly dialed down as they move into these areas. And so we mapped out what their sunset roles were and their sunrise roles, as they termed it. And the thing that was really compelling was, instead of doing what I described earlier, right? Firing a bunch of people over here, don't need your skills, and I'm going to go out and hire these other people. We actually showed their board that they could save £50,000 per employee by reskilling talent from their sunset roles to their sunrise roles. And if you take £50,000 and multiply it by the 40,000 people that would need to transition or that could transition, that gets to be a really big number, right? And that became the primary metric through which they assess the value and output from their transformation. And for anyone who looks at their numbers, they've reported record earnings the last 2 years, in part because they've just done such a flawless job of transforming their culture, moving from this 170-year-old, blue blood English bank that, only valued Cambridge and Oxford degrees to actually having skills be the currency for work and having talent pools that they've never tapped before, and transitioning talent from sales into relationship management, in some instances from IT into corporate banking, because of the fact that they've built those three capabilities, right? Work design, development, and the deployment. But that one number became the anchor for their North Star. And the North Star was all about, what will this look like if we do this well over the next 3 years, which was their time horizon? What will this look like to our shareholders, to our communities, to our leaders? What will it feel like to everyone who's going through this? What will our employees feel on this journey? What will HR feel as they are enabling this? And what are the foundational elements that will ensure that we're making skills the currency for work? So that's the North Star. The second key variable is how do we, as I said at the beginning, we're talking about a reversal of 140 years of organizational process, structure, leadership behavior. How do we start to experiment and make sure that we're doing this in safe zones? And so we talk about going narrow and shallow. Narrow is going deep in a couple of areas where we've got business problems that are going to justify us doing something differently. We've got a bottleneck in the process, we've got a cost issue, we've got a new piece of technology that we haven't gotten a return on. How do we reinvent and redesign work to be skills-powered or skills-based in those areas? Going shallow would mean taking one of your workforce or talent processes and completely reworking it end-to-end to be focused on skills. And what you've got here is a bit of a maturity matrix that shows that as the quality of your skills data increases, as you get deeper insight, as your analytics improve, what does that typically mean to your talent processes? The most common place where organizations start, the two most common places are their talent acquisition process. I don't know of any CEO or CHRO who is happy with his or her talent acquisition process. And the other is their internal mobility process. How do we enable the organization to deploy skills to work at much greater velocity? So two places to start to experiment. What's fascinating is watching that as organizations go down this path, this complete re-envisioning of what a career means. If you think, for those of us with the gray hair, like myself, a career has been inextricably linked to a job and the movement from one job to another. And that calculus is rapidly going out the window, right? Because those jobs themselves are changing, and increasingly what we're looking at is the movement of talent from one set of skills to another set of skills as jobs get consistently reconfigured. For those of us privileged enough, we're going to have, as we've seen in a number of organizations, the opportunity to craft our own jobs, right? What are the things that, my colleagues call it, sort of skill and say, but think of it as, what are the skills I have and what am I passionate about? Because I can then craft the unique areas that I want to contribute in, as long as it aligns with how the business model is changing. And the thing that's really intriguing is as we're seeing organizations jump on this bandwagon, is how they're changing their value propositions. I was talking to a young lady earlier who's going to go intern with United Airlines, who have been a client of mine for years. But another organization, not United, airlines are incredibly incestuous entities, right? You often get 3 generations of the same family working there because of the flight benefits. And so people tend to stay a long time. But this airline actually remade their value proposition to say, we will develop you for opportunity, either within or without. So we're not going to promise you a job for life. We're not going to promise you employment. We will promise you employability. You're going to come here for 3 to 5 years. You're going to acquire these great skills. You'll either go back to school or we'll place you with the hospitality sector that we collaborate with, or you might take on another position where your skills are valued. But our promise to you is one of continuous growth and development. The last key part of this is, I've talked a little bit about technology. Every organization that's going down the skills path tends to throw technology at the problem. in some way, shape, or form. Some lead with it, some have technology be a fast follower. What we've seen consistently is, and anyone who's done change management knows, is you've got to pull on all of these levers, right? And I know this is a bit of an eye chart, but all the way from leadership and governance to changing the culture, to changing some of your functional processes, all of those things become really important when you think about shifting the organization towards becoming skills-powered. The last thing I want to end with in my last 4 minutes is, what do the analytics look like? Why is this worth the price? Because as you can tell, it's a heavy lift, right? This isn't easy. It'd be easy to just go design the same organization that Henry Ford did around his assembly lines and sort of stick with that. Problem is, as we said at the beginning, that just doesn't work anymore. The world's moving far too quickly. Technology's moving far too quickly. So a couple of metrics that we've seen as organizations move from left to right, from the fix to the flex to the flow, what you start to see is a shift in the metrics at the bottom there. Much lower time to fill for various bodies of work. Insight into emerging and declining work. Understanding much sooner what work is going away, what work is emerging, versus relying perhaps on a manager to tell you that from a local market. Increase in labor productivity, I talked about that example with the insurance company, and certainly much greater degrees of speed and agility. We documented a few case studies to pick up on some of the most common metrics that we see. I talked about the increase in productivity there, the increase in speed and agility. When Unilever implemented their marketplace at the height of COVID, when they rolled it out broadly, they credited it with two things. One is their response to COVID, which was faster than any other consumer goods company around, because of how rapidly they were able to retool their manufacturing and distribution facilities, because of the insight they were able to get around what was changing. But also in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, the capacity management angle, the avoidance of having to go out and hire a bunch more people because we've unearthed skills that we need across the organization. The $60,000, that's the Standard Chartered example. Certainly greater levels of employee engagement. And the one that I'm really intrigued by, and not that I want you to go buy the book, although I do, but we talk at length about how a very large oil and gas organization, as they reinvented the work and was able to improve their profitability by 45% without any headcount losses, because of how they were able to reinvent for a more machine-augmented world, but at the same time, pivot people towards the emerging bodies of work where their productivity was higher. They were taking on, they acquired new skills that were increasingly required in a more machine-augmented exploration and production environment. And the last thing I want to leave you with is, this is a really quick piece of analysis that one of my colleagues did for a very large global consumer goods company just this last week. And it was like, what's the minimum that we think we're going to get from shifting to becoming skills-powered? And the simplest, the two easiest metrics are, what's the reduction in voluntary attrition we could get, because people now have insight into opportunities across the organization that they are qualified for and capable for. Every CHRO that I've worked with in my last 35 years of being a management consultant, every one of them has said how people consistently tell us that it's easier to find work outside the company than within the company. And boy, if we could just overcome that roadblock, right? If we've invested 20 years in bringing someone on, upskilling her, making her a part of our culture, and now she's got to leave because there isn't an opportunity, that's a lot of knowledge capital wasted. So the reduction in attrition was a significant number. The other was just that capacity management point I made, the unlock on productivity, because we're extending and stretching the workforce across new bodies of work. So a couple of analytics that I hope are helpful. But I think with that, I'm going to hand it back to Matthew. Thank you.